body is having a chemical conversation your brain doesn't even know about right now. The way you're sitting, the expression on your face, whether someone touched your shoulder this morning, all of it is quietly nudging a stress hormone called cortisol up or down. Today, we're getting into non-verbal body language and its effects on cortisol. Specifically, we're going to break down what the science actually confirms, where a very popular idea got seriously overcorrected, and what you can realistically do with all of this. By the end, you'll understand the real relationship between how your body moves and what your hormones are doing, and you'll be able to spot the difference between solid research and hype. I've got someone here who's been deep in this topic, so let's not waste any time. Walk me into this. What even is cortisol, and why should we care about it in the context of body language?
So cortisol is often called the stress hormone, but that framing undersells it. It's produced by the adrenal glands, and it's regulated by what researchers call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. And according to a 2023 review published in Frontiers in Endocrinology, stress is essentially a state of real or perceived threat to homeostasis. And the HPA axis is the system that manages that response. Cortisol is the chemical output of that system.
So it's not just about feeling stressed, it's a whole biological cascade.
Exactly. And a 2017 review in the journal X-Skili, which looked at the broad impact of stress on body function, makes the point that stress responses can range from minor alterations in homeostasis all the way to life-threatening effects. So cortisol isn't just a mood thing. It has real downstream consequences for your cardiovascular system, your cognition, your immune function.
Okay, so cortisol is serious. Now, where does body language come in? Because that feels like a big leap from hormones to how you're standing.
It's actually not as big a leap as it sounds. Nonverbal communication is this whole umbrella that includes facial expressions, gestures, posture, eye contact, touch, what researchers call haptics, and even how close you stand to someone, which is proxemics. A 2024 article in the European Heart Journal laid this out really clearly, describing nonverbal communication as comprising haptics, gestures, proxemics, facial expressions, paralinguistics, body language, appearance, eye contact, and artifacts. It's a rich system.
That's a lot of channels of communication happening simultaneously.
Right. And the key insight is that these channels don't just communicate outward to other people, they also feed back inward to your own biology. That's where the cortisol connection starts to get interesting.
Okay, so before we get into the research, I have to bring up the elephant in the room, power poses. Because for a while there, that was everywhere. The idea that if you stand like a superhero for 2 minutes, your cortisol drops and your testosterone spikes. What actually happened with that?
So this is genuinely one of the most instructive stories in recent psychology. The original studies on power posing claimed that expansive body positions, standing wide, arms out, taking up space, would raise testosterone, lower cortisol, and increase risk-taking. And those studies got enormous media attention.
Yeah, it was everywhere. Job interview prep, sports psychology, self-help, the whole thing.
And then it faced enormous criticism because the results couldn't be replicated. So a team of psychologists from Germany and the United States ran what the APA described as the largest sample of studies on body positions so far, a pre-registered meta-analysis published in Psychological Bulletin. They searched 12 scientific databases, found over 24,000 potentially relevant studies, and narrowed it down to 128 experiments with almost 10,000 participants.
That's a massive sample. So what did they find?
Here's where it gets nuanced. They found clear evidence that both power poses and upright postures affect self-perception. When people took expansive or upright positions, they felt better and more confident than when they took contractive or hunched positions. And that held across males and females of all ages in both Western and Eastern countries.
Okay, so the psychological effect is real.
The psychological effect is real, but, and this is the critical part, there was no evidence for effects on hormones. No effect on testosterone, no effect on cortisol, no effect on heart rate or skin conductance. The hormonal claim, the one that made the whole thing go viral, didn't hold up.
Wait, so the thing everyone remembered, the cortisol drop from power posing, that's not supported?
Not by the best available evidence, no. The APA summary of that meta-analysis is pretty clear on this. And it's actually a really important distinction because it doesn't mean body language doesn't matter. It means the specific mechanism people were claiming, the hormonal one, wasn't there. The psychological confidence effect is still real and still meaningful.
So it's like your body language changes how you feel about yourself, but it's not directly rewiring your hormone levels in the way the original hype suggested.
That's a good way to put it. And the meta-analysis also noted that it's still unclear whether the effects come from taking high-power poses or from avoiding low-power hunched positions. That distinction matters a lot for how we interpret the research.
That's actually kind of a relief in a weird way. Like, the story is more honest now.
Yeah, and it's a good example of science doing what it's supposed to do, correcting itself. The initial studies got attention, they got scrutinized, and the field updated. That's the process working.
Okay, so if posture isn't directly moving the cortisol needle, what nonverbal signals actually do have a documented relationship with cortisol?
Touch is probably the strongest one. There's research on what's called interpersonal touch, physical contact between people, and its ability to mitigate physical and psychological distress. A study published in Nature's Scientific Reports looked at huggable communication devices, essentially objects designed to replicate the effects of interpersonal touch, specifically because the cortisol-lowering effects of touch are real enough that researchers wanted to reproduce them artificially.
Wait, they built a robot hug machine to study this?
Essentially, yes. The premise is that interpersonal touch is a fundamental component of social interactions because it can reduce distress, and the interest in replicating that effect artificially tells you how significant the researchers consider it to be.
That's wild. So a hug, or even a touch on the shoulder, is doing something measurable at the hormonal level.
That's what the research suggests, and it connects to a broader point about social integration. There's evidence that people with a flatter diurnal cortisol decline, meaning their cortisol doesn't drop as much over the course of the day as it should, may be at increased risk for cardiovascular disease. And social connection, including physical touch, is one of the factors that supports healthy cortisol rhythms.
So isolation isn't just emotionally bad, it might literally show up in your cortisol curve.
That's what the evidence points toward. The research on social integration and diurnal cortisol decline makes that connection.
Okay, let's shift to facial expressions because I think that's where things get really interesting. There's a two-way street here, right? Cortisol affects how you read faces, and faces affect cortisol?
Yes, and this is one of the more surprising findings in this space. A study published in Scientific Reports by Brown, Ryo, and Netta looked at how cortisol affects the way people interpret ambiguous facial expressions. Specifically, they had participants rate facial expressions, clear ones like happy or angry, and ambiguous ones like surprised, before and after a stress manipulation.
And what happened?
Elevations in cortisol were associated with more negative ratings of surprised faces. So when people were stressed and their cortisol was up, they were more likely to read an ambiguous expression, a surprised face, as negative rather than neutral or positive. And the effect was driven specifically by the stress group, not the control group.
So high cortisol literally makes you more pessimistic about what you're seeing on someone's face.
That's exactly what the data shows. The researchers describe it as a stronger negativity bias during ambiguous affective decision-making. And think about what that means in real life. If you're stressed, you're more likely to misread a neutral or ambiguous expression from a colleague or a partner as hostile or negative.
That could spiral so fast. You're stressed, you misread someone's face, you react badly, they get defensive, and now you've got a conflict that started from a chemical state.
Exactly. And the study notes that stress prioritizes automatic emotional processing, which, in the context of this negativity bias, means your brain is essentially jumping to conclusions faster and with less nuance when cortisol is elevated.
That's a really practical thing to know. Like, if you're in a high-stress moment, maybe pump the brakes before you decide what someone's expression meant.
That's a genuinely useful takeaway, and it connects to a broader body of work on hormones and facial processing. A systematic review from the University of Valencia, published in the journal Biology in 2021, looked at the role of oxytocin, cortisol, and testosterone in facial emotional processing. Their conclusion was that these hormones do influence how we process facial expressions, but the relationship isn't straightforward. It depends on factors like emotional valence and the participant's gender.
So it's not a clean one-to-one relationship?
Not at all. The University of Valencia review found that the results didn't present a consistent pattern of association. The hormones slightly influenced facial emotion processing, but establishing a direct causal link is, in their words, extremely difficult. Context matters enormously.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the posture and cortisol link, because even if power poses don't directly change hormones, there's still research on posture and the autonomic nervous system, right?
Yes, and this is where it gets interesting again. A study on ResearchGate looked at two different types of postures in healthy adults and measured autonomic nervous function and stress hormones in saliva before and after the posture intervention. The autonomic nervous system and the HPA axis, the cortisol system, are closely linked, so posture's effect on one can ripple into the other.
And there's also that PMC study connecting cortisol awakening responses to postural control, right? That one was kind of mind-bending.
Yeah, that one is fascinating. A 2021 study published in Healthcare looked at whether the cortisol awakening response, basically how much cortisol spikes in the morning when you wake up, was associated with visual dependency in postural control. And they found that participants with smaller cortisol awakening responses had greater deterioration in postural sway when exposed to moving visual stimuli.
So lower morning cortisol meant worse balance?
In that study, yes. The researchers noted there are known links between the HPA axis and the systems responsible for regulating posture. It's a two-way street. Cortisol affects how your body holds itself in space, and how your body holds itself in space feeds back into your stress system.
That's kind of a loop that I don't think most people think about at all.
Most people don't. And it's a good reminder that the body isn't divided into neat compartments. Your stress hormones, your posture, your balance, your emotional processing, they're all talking to each other constantly.
Let's talk about social stress for a second, because there's a really interesting research tool called the Trier Social Stress Test. Can you explain what that is and why it matters here?
The Trier Social Stress Test, or TSST, is one of the most widely used laboratory stress paradigms. Essentially, you put someone in front of a panel of evaluators and make them give an impromptu speech and do mental arithmetic under observation. It's designed to reliably spike cortisol. A meta-analysis published in Comprehensive Psychoneuroendocrinology in 2022 looked at 65 articles involving 76 sub-studies and over 5,000 participants.
And what did that meta-analysis find?
The average effect size for salivary cortisol reactivity was 0.93. That's a large effect. And the study found that speech topics, sex, and their interaction could predict cortisol responses, explaining about 42% of the total experimental variation. Sex was the only significant contributing factor in the regression model, with males showing significantly higher cortisol responses than females.
So the social context, being watched, being evaluated, is a massive cortisol trigger. And that's deeply tied to nonverbal dynamics, right? Because when you're being evaluated, you're hyper aware of your own body language.
Completely. And a review of cortisol stress reactivity to public speaking from Hampton-Sydney College actually quotes Mark Twain on this. He said there are two types of speakers, those that are nervous and those that are liars. Public speaking is described as the most prevalent social fear, and the cortisol response to it is measurable and significant.
That Twain quote is so good. And it kind of captures something real. The body's stress response to being seen and judged is almost universal.
And what's interesting is that the nonverbal signals you're sending during that moment, your posture, your eye contact, your facial expressions, are being read by the audience and feeding back into your own stress system simultaneously. It's a feedback loop happening in real time.
So your body language is both a cause and an effect of your cortisol state at the same time.
That's a really clean way to put it. And it's why the European Heart Journal piece on body language in science and academia is so relevant. It points out that a presenter who maintains confident eye contact, uses purposeful gestures, and exhibits an open posture is perceived as more credible and persuasive. That perception from the audience changes the social dynamic, which in turn affects the speaker's stress response.
So even if the posture isn't directly dropping your cortisol, it's changing how people respond to you, which changes the social threat level, which then affects your cortisol. It's just one step removed.
Exactly. And that's actually a more sophisticated and probably more accurate model than the original power pose claim. The body language shapes the social environment, and the social environment shapes the hormonal response.
I want to push back on something slightly, though. Because if the direct hormonal effect of posture isn't there and the facial expression stuff is complicated and context dependent, is there a risk that people overcorrect and dismiss the whole body language cortisol connection entirely?
That's a fair challenge. And I think the answer is yes, there's that risk. The nuanced truth is that the relationship is real but indirect and context dependent. Touch has a documented cortisol effect. Social stress, which is deeply nonverbal, has a massive cortisol effect. Elevated cortisol changes how you read faces. These are all real findings. What's not supported is the clean, direct, 2-minute pose drops your cortisol version.
So the mechanism is messier than the headline, but the phenomenon is real.
That's the honest summary. And honestly, the messier version is more interesting because it means there are multiple levers: touch, social connection, how you manage your stress state before a high-stakes interaction, rather than one magic trick.
Multiple levers. I like that framing. So when you step back from all of this, what does it actually come down to for someone who wants to use this information?
A few things. First, don't expect your posture to directly change your cortisol. The evidence doesn't support that specific claim. But do recognize that posture and body language have real psychological effects on confidence and self-perception. And those psychological states influence how you navigate social situations, which does affect your stress response.
And the touch piece is underrated, I think.
Hugely underrated. The research on interpersonal touch and cortisol reduction is some of the more robust stuff in this space. Physical connection, a handshake, a hug, a hand on the shoulder has a measurable effect on stress hormones. And in a world where a lot of us are more isolated than ever, that's worth taking seriously.
And then the face reading piece, knowing that when you're stressed, your cortisol is literally biasing you toward reading neutral faces as threatening. That's actionable.
That might be the most immediately practical thing from all of this. The scientific report studies showed that elevated cortisol pushes you toward a negativity bias in reading ambiguous expressions. So in a high-stress moment, before you react to what you think you saw on someone's face, it's worth asking whether your stress state is coloring that read.
That's a genuinely useful pause to build in. Like, am I reading this situation clearly, or is my cortisol doing the reading for me?
Exactly. And that's the kind of self-awareness that the research actually supports. Not the idea that you can hack your hormones with a 2-minute pose, but that understanding the cortisol body language loop gives you more agency in how you move through stressful situations.
Here's what this really comes down to. The story of body language and cortisol is a story about a loop, not a switch. Your nonverbal signals shape your social environment. Your social environment shapes your stress response. Your stress response shapes how you read the world around you. And that loop runs constantly, whether you're aware of it or not.
And the research gives us specific places to intervene in that loop. Touch matters. It's one of the clearest nonverbal inputs with a documented cortisol effect. Social connection matters. A flatter cortisol curve across the day is linked to cardiovascular risk, and isolation contributes to that. And stress awareness matters. Knowing that high cortisol biases your face reading toward negativity is a tool you can actually use.
And the power pose thing, it's not that it's useless, it's just that the effect is psychological, not hormonal. You might feel more confident, and that confidence changes how you show up, which changes how people respond to you. The mechanism is just more indirect than the original claim.
Right. And the APA meta-analysis, 128 experiments, nearly 10,000 participants, is pretty definitive on that. The self-perception effect is real, and it crosses cultures and genders. The hormonal effect isn't there. Both of those things can be true at the same time.
Science containing multitudes. Okay, so we started this episode with the idea that your body is having a chemical conversation your brain doesn't know about. And I think what we've landed on is now you know what it's saying. Your cortisol is being shaped by who touches you, how stressed you feel in social situations, and it's shaping how you read every face you encounter. That's not a small thing.
It's really not. And the fact that the popular version of this story, the power pose cortisol hack, turned out to be more complicated is actually good news. Because the real picture gives you more to work with, not less.
More levers, not fewer. That's a good place to land. Thanks for being here and breaking all of this down, and thanks to everyone listening to Copilot Podcasts. Next time you're in a high-stakes conversation and you catch yourself reading someone's face as hostile, just remember, it might not be them. It might be your cortisol doing the talking.